issues, using critical source material as our foundation. Today, we're really diving deep into, well, a complex landscape, societal control and individual agency, specifically how our collective reality might be engineered.
Right. And the central question we're tackling is this. When you consider the, frankly, sophisticated methods of societal control and manipulation described in the material, what are the most effective strategies and, importantly, ethically sound strategies for citizens to, well, reclaim some individual agency and resist this engineering of reality?
Exactly. My perspective is going to focus on the necessity and I think the practical efficacy of collective but subtle resistance. Ways to disrupt systems from within, essentially.
And I'll be approaching it from a slightly different angle. I absolutely see the vital importance of resisting manipulation. I mean, who wouldn't? But I want to emphasize the profound depth and, frankly, the insidiousness of this engineered reality we're talking about. We need to explore the deep psychological manipulation that's potentially at play and also grapple with some pretty tricky ethical paradoxes inherent in certain resistance tactics.
Okay, let's start there. The material makes it strikingly clear, I think, that we're facing a highly sophisticated form of societal control. I mean, you look at something like Project 2025, it's described not just as, a policy paper, but as a detailed step-by-step schematic for engineering a very specific version of reality.
It's called a cybernetic move to control the feedback loops of the state itself. And its aim is explicitly stated as rewriting the source code of public belief. I mean, these aren't just tweaks to administration, they're mechanisms designed to fundamentally shift our social and political reality. But, and this is my core point, despite these really formidable forces, I firmly believe citizens are far from powerless. We have a diverse array of strategies. Many are low risk, actually, but capable of high impact when you think about creating friction within these systems. I'm thinking about tactics outlined in sources like the Simple Sabotage Field Manual and maybe the Free Time Broadcasts. They talk about simple sabotage and bureaucratic warfare.
Right, the OSS manual.
Exactly. Imagine just acting slowly in your workplace, meticulously questioning minute details, or, subtly misplacing tools. Even causing accelerated wear and tear on equipment, think minor friction, glancing blows, maybe grit in lubrication systems. It adds up. And now, in our digital age, resistance is just as crucial. Documenting online system failures, engaging in what's called an opt-out offensive for data collection. Or, this is interesting, leveraging accessibility audit angles to force administrative work and assert some digital autonomy. The profound thing here, I think, is that these seemingly online system failures, engaging in what's called an opt-out offensive for data collection. Or, this is interesting, leveraging accessibility audit angles to force administrative work and assert some digital autonomy. The profound thing here, I think, is that these seemingly small individual acts collectively reclaim agency. They generate systemic friction that perhaps, ironically, kind of aligns with how our constitutional design already incorporates inefficiencies specifically to limit unchecked governmental power. It's about using the system's own weight against itself.
That's certainly a perspective, and I agree wholeheartedly on the imperative of resistance. But I'd frame the challenge a bit differently. The sheer depth of this engineered reality, as described, it presents truly profound challenges to what we even mean by effective agency. You see, these control methods aren't just administrative. They really delve into deep psychological manipulation. The material discusses dark triad methods.
Right. Defined as this cluster. Manipulation, narcissism, psychopathy, a lack of empathy, putting self-interest above all, a disregard for truth, a willingness to exploit. It's pretty chilling stuff, and this is often coupled with what's termed engineered consent. This is where public agreement is basically manufactured by subtly tapping into unconscious desires. A powerful mechanism for this is something called hyperstition. Think of it like fictions that, through widespread belief and collective action, can literally speak a new, often terrifying reality into existence.
Okay.
We have historical examples, chilling ones, like Project MKUltra. This was a top-secret CIA program aiming to, and these are the words used, re-engineer human consciousness and reprogram the human mind. They used drugs like LSD on unwitting subjects, even tried replacing true memories with false ones. The goal wasn't efficiency. It was about creating a fractured hall of mirrors where ultimately nobody knows what's true anymore. When you control the information nervous system for a whole society, as the Pisamont framework outlines, it's a model for understanding how information shapes societal behavior. You can create what it calls R-selected cognitive chaos in the majority.
Meaning?
Meaning most people are just overwhelmed by conflicting information, noise. It leads to short-term, reactive thinking. It makes them susceptible to falling into these self-sealing bubbles where any contradictory fact is just dismissed as fake news. So in that kind of environment, how effective can, well, superficial resistance truly be? And here's the ethical paradox I mentioned. If resistance itself starts adopting dark triad methods to fight back, doesn't it risk becoming another form of tyranny? Doesn't it perpetuate the very erosion of public trust and autonomy that people like Norbert Wiener warned about regarding the, quote, purely selfish exploitation of cybernetic possibilities?
I see your concern about the depth of the psychological manipulation, absolutely. But I actually think it highlights why subtle sabotage can be effective in its own way. You talk about insidious control, okay, but imagine the cumulative effect of these, yes, seemingly minor acts of simple sabotage when multiplied by, say, thousands of citizen saboteurs. This can create an overwhelming force. These actions, slowing work down, making deliberate mistakes, causing equipment wear, subtly disrupting communications like delaying telegrams, misfiling documents, maybe jamming radio signals back in the day. They aren't just irritants. They act as a constant and tangible drag on oppressive systems. The deeper implication, I think, is that these micro-level disruptions consume vast amounts of resources, time, manpower. They force the system to divert its focus, its energy, away from consolidating power or pushing its agenda, and instead deal with all this internal friction. It's not about, outright revolution, but about making the machinery of control less workable from within. Each small act, if it's networked, if it becomes widespread, builds into a collective force that can genuinely destabilize operations. It makes it harder for that top-down control to function efficiently or adapt quickly. So even against sophisticated psychological control, by disrupting the mechanisms that deliver that control, I think we can still create meaningful impact.
Well, I understand the appeal of that vision, widespread micro-disruption. I remain concerned that such tactics, while certainly disruptive locally, often fail to address the core problem, that systemic information control, that engineering of reality itself. These minor disruptions, they can often be easily dismissed by the system as just noise, or sometimes even co-opted by systems that are primarily designed for self-preservation. Think about the example given of the FCC chairman putting aggressive pressure on media companies like Disney, trying to, quote, extort these companies to toe the line, maybe pull content like Jimmy Kimmel's show.
Right.
Or the U.S. Justice Department quietly deleting a study on far-right extremism because it contradicted the administration's narrative. These are clear examples of top-down information control. They show the system's capacity to shape public perception at a really fundamental level. When hyperstition can, as the material says, literally speak a new terrifying reality into existence just through belief, well, individual acts of sabotage might just be distractions. They might fail to counteract the manufactured consensus that actually underpins the control structure. The system can simply reframe these acts or filter out information about them and maintain its narrative dominance. So how do you see these subtle acts of sabotage effectively combating the psychological aspects of control I highlighted, rather than just the logistical ones?
That's a fair challenge, and I think it brings us nicely to how bureaucratic resistance can potentially reclaim agency beyond just logistics. I'm not quite convinced these systems are as impervious to internal friction as you might suggest. Let's look closer at those bureaucratic warfare tactics. Things like requesting endless clarification on complex directives, right? Or employing the lost-in-translation gambit. These force the system to expend significant resources just clarifying its own rules, untangling its own jargon. Over-compliance maneuvers, like providing excessive but technically correct paperwork, can absolutely paralyze clerks and importantly highlight systemic flaws, revealing the absurdity of the system perhaps even to those operating within it.
Okay.
Digital accessibility audits can trigger investigations, costly fixes, forcing administrative work while simultaneously letting citizens assert some autonomy. These actions aren't just about disruption. They force the system to confront its own inconsistencies and consume its own resources. They turn its own ponderous nature against itself. And furthermore, by actively engaging in things like opt-out offensives to protect our digital footprint, we reclaim agency over our data, directly challenging the automated systems of control. These aren't just isolated acts. They can build collective awareness, foster community, empowering citizens to actively participate in shaping their environment, rather than being passively managed. They create these friction points that I argue can eventually slow down or expose the psychological manipulation mechanisms themselves by gumming up the works.
I agree. These tactics can be frustrating for the system, certainly, but I just don't buy that they fundamentally reclaim agency against a system that exhibits, as the material describes it, pathological autopoiesis, meaning its primary function is self-organization and self-preservation, and critically, it can wait. The system's inherent indifference often means that bureaucratic friction, while maybe annoying, fails to dismantle its core power structures. And in fact, bureaucratic warfare is frequently deployed against citizens, not just by them. Think about the example of the Republican megabills, mandatory work requirements, and the frequent eligibility checks for Medicaid. These aren't accidents. They seem intentionally designed to create a paperwork burden to, quote, kick millions off insurance and essentially punish poverty. They trap people in an economic squeeze that actively reduces their capacity for meaningful resistance.
Right.
This creates that environment in the majority. People are so overwhelmed, so exhausted by immediate survival needs and confusing information that they simply can't think clearly or strategically, which ironically benefits what the material calls a strategic K minority, a smaller, focused group that remains insulated from this chaos and can thus maintain control much more easily. So while individuals might feel a momentary sense of agency performing these small acts, the overall systemic impact could actually be a further erosion of choice and opportunity, deepening reliance on a system deliberately designed to make resistance incredibly difficult.
While acknowledging those significant systemic pressures, and they are significant, I believe the emphasis on individual and collective constitutional literacy offers a robust defense against that interpretive confusion and the erosion of trust you describe. I champion what could be called interpretive disobedience, the idea that citizens should actively read and critically think about the Constitution for themselves, rather than just passively outsourcing their understanding to supposed experts or authorities. The Lakeville Constitutional Festival, featuring Thomas Harrington's talk on the 10th Amendment, is mentioned as a powerful example of this democratic constitutionalism. It directly challenges what the material calls interpretive alchemy, that subtle twisting of old laws until they essentially mean their opposite or their original meaning is just lost.
This direct engagement, I think, fosters a shared understanding of foundational principles. It makes it harder for external forces to manipulate narratives or undermine our rights through sneaky reinterpretation. And beyond just the constitutional text, practical tools like basic financial literacy are also essential for personal agency. Understanding how economic systems work empowers individuals to navigate that economic squeeze you described with, perhaps, greater autonomy. It allows them to resist systemic financial control that often parallels constitutional manipulation. It's really about empowering citizens to understand the fundamental rules of the game, both legal and financial, and to challenge their deliberate misinterpretation, thereby reclaiming, I think, a profound level of agency.
I agree wholeheartedly on the ideal, the absolute ideal of constitutional literacy and critical thinking. It's essential for a functioning republic, no question. However, I seriously question its practical viability in a political landscape increasingly dominated by, let's face it, blood sport politics and weaponized government agencies. How does one maintain a shared basis for truth which is fundamental to any meaningful constitutional discourse, when, as we discussed, deliberately destroyed files like those from Project MKUltra create a fractured hall of mirrors where, quite literally, nobody knows what's true anymore?
That's the challenge.
Exactly. When studies like the Department of Justice's own on far-right extremism are quietly deleted simply to suppress inconvenient truths, a pervasive distrust inevitably emerges. It undermines the very foundation needed for critical engagement. Without a shared, verifiable basis for truth, constitutional interpretation risks becoming just a matter of preference, as the